The disbandment of the iconic band The Beatles in 1970 remains one of the biggest and most scrutinized moments in the music industry. On top of the world in the 1960s, the band created history with timeless music, but at the end of the decade, things began to take a sour turn for the group. For years, rumors speculated for the actual cause of this breakup. Legendary bassist Paul McCartney has been candid with his frustrations over time, particularly with the influence of John Lennon's wife, Yoko Ono. In the studio, many fans have blamed her for the split, making her the scapegoat for the media. However, McCartney's recent reflections suggest it's more complex than that. So, let's dive into the details of the split and McCartney's evolving view on Ono and other reasons why the band might have broken up. Find out what really happened between them during the breakup of the Beatles and whether they were ever able to reconcile from a series of interviews spanning over 50 years. The Grammy winner's initial frustration with Ono was no surprise. Much of the rift between the band's two engines, Paul McCartney and John Lennon, can be traced back to the tension that Lennon's new artistic endeavors and personal connections with Ono created. According to McCartney, in the recording of the White Album, Ono was present for much of the time spent in the studio. Although there was no objection to this from any band members, it wasn't without reservation. The bassist had referred to Ono as an interference in the workplace, hinting at the building tensions. What an awkward situation it must have been. John Lennon's insistence to have his wife on set was an obvious hint at the shifting priorities of Lennon. Interestingly, Ono wasn't just a passive observer, she was an actual active influence on Lennon's creative process. Some believe that it must have made McCartney and the rest feel sidelined, further straining group dynamics and making recording complicated. It was surely a frustrating situation for everyone, but they kept quiet to avoid conflict and also increase productivity. According to McCartney, they did it because it had to be done. It was their job and not up to negotiation. In a recent episode of his podcast, McCartney: A Life in Lyrics, he explored the details of Ono's role in the group. He states that the getting together of the couple was bound to affect the group dynamic. Things like Yoko being literally in the middle of the recording session were something you had to deal with. He commented that if John wanted this to happen, then it should happen. There's no reason it shouldn't. It certainly did not help when Lennon was the one to be the first to break away from the group. This news was revealed to the public much later, but initially Paul McCartney was to take the fall for the group. It must have added on to his anger. The story, however, doesn't end here. In a shocking turn of events, Paul McCartney shifted his view on Ono over time. In an interview given decades after the breakup, McCartney revealed that blaming Ono for the dissolution of the Beatles was an oversimplification of the truth. He later went on to reveal that the band had already been on shaky grounds, heading towards the end of the journey even before Ono, thus absolving the blame from Yoko Ono and perhaps ending the dispute over his apparent feud with Lennon's widow. To blame Ono as the sole and main reason for the split would be inaccurate and unjustified. This shift in narrative proved to be crucial because in doing so McCartney dispelled the widow from the decades of hostility she had been receiving from the band's die-hard fans. Ono herself compares their fans' treatment of her to being accused of false murder. What a relief it must have been for her to put all this behind. McCartney even stated that he thought the two made a great couple and were indeed a powerful team. The split resulted from a complex mix of reasons rather than placing all the blame on one person. So, what exactly caused the Beatles to break up? Let's look at some other factors that might have been responsible for the group splitting and the deeper reasons behind the end of one of the most influential bands in music history. There had been several reasons, including the interference between creative differences and personal goals, a complex of reasons that shouldn't be placed all on one woman's shoulder. By the late 1960s, there had been many creative differences inside the group. Each member of the Beatles had been evolving in their artistic direction. Lennon was diving into avant-garde art and experimenting with his music, heavily influenced by his wife, Ono. On the other hand, McCartney was leaning toward more traditional pop melodies. This drift increased the tension between two artists who had worked together previously for years. It must have been natural to blame the new outsider for the distance. Continuously thought this independence must have made it hard to work together, even creating more space for the disbandment of the group. As McCartney reflected, the four different yet strong personalities in one band were bound to end up splitting. Another possible factor to look at is that the Beatles' rise in fame had come so suddenly that the pressure on them was through the roof, and this pressure was bound to take its toll. By the late 1960s, the band had stopped touring and was spending all its time in the studio. While that may have created some of the most iconic albums, it also proved to be the period when the cracks in the band started showing. They hadn't been on tour for a while, and working just on set proved to be frustrating for the band members. Among these complex tangles of reasons, another crucial factor for the band's breakup was the shift in management. Much of McCartney's frustrations and annoyance were directed at their latest manager, Alan Klein. After the death of the band's previous manager, Brian Epstein's D in 1967, the band floundered without the guidance of their manager. The new manager did not get along with McCartney. The bassist notes that he had wanted to fight the new manager. Mostly he would later continue to give a lawsuit to Klein to stop him from dealing with the band's finances. Afterward, McCartney took a break for some time. During this period of isolation in Scotland, McCartney's mental health took a hit. The weight of losing the Beatles, coupled with the legal battles, left him questioning not only his future but his place in music history. He has recalled in interviews that he turned to alcohol and struggled to find meaning in his daily life, often feeling lost and uncertain. It wasn't until Linda, his wife, encouraged him to start creating music again that McCartney found a renewed sense of purpose. This phase of his life, though challenging, ultimately laid the foundation for his solo career and the formation of Wings. However, even with his newfound success, the shadow of the Beatles loomed large over McCartney for years to come, causing him to reflect back on it multiple times in his interview and eventually come to forgive and absolve the blame from Ono. With the mounting tensions and new dynamic, it's safe to say that the end of the Beatles was inevitable. Looking back at the past, McCartney recognized the nuance of these things, even if the split had proven to be the hardest period in his life. One thing was made clear, though: Ono wasn't the villain she had been painted to be in the story of the Beatles. The breakdown of the Beatles was not the result of one single incident, but a culmination of tensions, changes, and personal evolutions that made their split feel, in retrospect, almost unavoidable. One of the most glaring reasons was the shift in their creative dynamic. As time passed, the once collaborative and harmonious songwriting partnership between Lennon and McCartney began to fracture. Both John and Paul were musical powerhouses, but their visions for the band's future started to diverge. McCartney sought to preserve the band's essence, favoring polished, melodic pop and structured recording sessions, while Lennon, increasingly influenced by his personal life and Yoko Ono, leaned into more experimental, raw, and avant-garde directions. What had once been a symbiotic partnership evolved into a competition of sorts, with both pushing their distinct visions, creating a rift that grew with every recording session. George Harrison, too, had his grievances. By the late 1960s, Harrison's songwriting had matured to a level where he felt his contributions deserved equal attention. However, he found himself constantly overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney juggernaut. Tracks like Here Comes the Sun and Something were undeniable masterpieces. But Harrison's frustrations grew as his artistic voice was often sidelined during discussions about the band's creative direction. Harrison once even walked out of a recording session, further highlighting the deep-rooted discord. However, perhaps the most personal blow was Lennon's evolving relationship with Yoko Ono. While Ono was often blamed for breaking up the band, the reality is far more complex. Lennon's bond with Ono was intense, and she became an integral part of his life, creatively and personally. Her presence in the studio during recording something previously unheard of for the other band members created tension. But it was less about Ono herself and more about what she represented: Lennon's growing desire for independence, for a life and a musical identity outside of the Beatles. It was clear that Lennon was ready to move on, and as his commitment to the band waned, so did the cohesion that had once defined the Beatles. The pressures of fame, the weight of their legacy, and the changing tides of their personal lives made their split feel almost predestined. Looking back, it becomes evident that the Beatles had outgrown themselves. Each member was on a different trajectory, with unique dreams, ambitions, and creative needs. The breakup was a bitter pill to swallow for their millions of fans, but for the four members themselves, it was a necessary evolution. As McCartney would later reflect, the end of the Beatles was as painful for him as it was for the fans, but it opened the door for each of them to find their own voice outside of the shadow of the greatest band in history. So, what do you think about McCartney's views on Yoko Ono? Looking at all this, what do you think the actual reason was for the disbandment of one of the most phenomenal groups to ever exist? Do you believe that Ono played a hand in the band's breakup, and subsequently do you think the treatment of Ono had been right and justified? We would love to know what you think, so share your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you for watching.